Welcome everyone. Bienvenidos a todos. Please turn your attention to the interpretation team. Por favor, preste atención al equipo de interpretación.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias. Hi, my name is Talis. I'm here with my co-interpreter Mojde, and we will be providing simultaneous interpretation between English and Spanish during today's session. And to access it, if you're here via a computer, there's a little globe at the bottom center of your screen that says interpretation. You can click there, and there you can select your channel of preference in which you would like to listen and participate in the call in. If you are bilingual in English and Spanish, you do not need to select a channel. But if you are not bilingual in English and Spanish, please go ahead and select the English channel so that you don't miss out on anything that might be shared in Spanish. If you're here via a smartphone, there are three little dots at the bottom right corner of your Zoom app that say More. You can click there, and once again, select language interpretation, and once again, select the English channel. Buenas tardes, yo me llamo Talis, estoy aquí con mi cointérprete Mojde y vamos a proporcionar interpretación simultánea del español al inglés y del inglés al español durante la sesión del día de hoy. Y para acceder a la interpretación, si están aquí a través de una computadora, hay un globito en la parte inferior en medio que dice interpretación. Pueden hacer clic ahí y ahí van a poder seleccionar su canal de preferencia, inglés o español, en el que prefieran escuchar y participar en la llamada. Si son completamente bilingües en inglés y en español, no necesitan seleccionar un canal, pero si prefieren escuchar la presentación en español, pueden seleccionar el canal de español. Si están aquí a través de un teléfono inteligente, hay tres puntitos en la parte inferior derecha de su aplicación de Zoom que dicen más. Pueden hacer clic ahí. De nuevo, seleccionar interpretación de idiomas y de nuevo pueden seleccionar el canal de español. If there are any issues with interpretation, please let us know through the chat and we will try to help you out as soon as we can. Y si hay cualquier problema con la interpretación, por favor avísenos a través del chat y les ayudaremos en cuanto podamos. Thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you to the interpreters. Hi everyone, I'm Heidi Notario. I use she, ella pronouns, and I'm the Vice President of Strategic Partnerships and Systems Change with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I have curly hair, short on the left side and longer on the right, and I'm wearing glasses that I have black rimmed. I have a long sleeve shirt that's dark blue. I'm wearing a pink tie, and I'm also wearing a black blazer. Before we begin, we'd like to review some brief housekeeping items with you. We are committed to making this an equitable space in which people of all abilities can participate fully and in their preferred language. This takes everyone's commitment and effort to make a reality. For example, we have limited use of the chat function. It's difficult to translate the chat in real time and can be inaccessible to assistive devices. Please send questions, comments, or resources directly to the event hosts and co-hosts. We'll read the questions or comments aloud so they can be interpreted. While we aim to make this a mixed ability and multilingual space, we also know we're still learning how to do this well. Please reach out to event staff throughout this session if you are experiencing any accessibility issues. We'll also ask about accessibility in our post-webinar evaluation. Please let us know your experiences and ways we can improve. We know we have much to learn and we want to improve our practice. This event features live captioning. You can access this feature by clicking Caption at the bottom of your screen. We are recording the event and will share it through our website and YouTube channel. The Q&A feature provides an opportunity for attendees to enter questions for the presenters to respond to. Please reach out to our staff if you are experiencing ongoing technical difficulties, but please note, we may have limited capacity to resolve these while the session is running. Today, policy and research briefing will include lessons learned and research findings from critical work that began about a year or so ago. This work is part of NRCDV's ongoing commitment to centering Black and Brown survivors, their families and communities. We'll have the opportunity to learn about the Black Immigrant Project from trailblazers and organizers that work within those communities. We will learn about the findings from a small pilot research project on the use of flexible funds to respond to housing insecurity among Black and Brown, queer and trans people of color in central Pennsylvania. And then we'll end with policy highlights and implications of this critical work. And now I'm going to turn it over to Chandel Dawson, the Director of the Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services, and what has made this work possible for NRCDV. Welcome, Chandel.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you for your leadership. I appreciate the leadership of the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and all of their partners. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm so pleased to join you all. I am Chandel Dawson, the Director of the new Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services in the Administration for Children and Families, Department of Health and Human Services. I want to welcome you to the Safe Housing Capacity Building Center's policy briefing. It's really an honor to be able to stand in solidarity with such amazing people leading incredible change on behalf of survivors in their communities every day. We learn a lot from each other, and we've learned a lot from all of you. And I want to thank you for continuing to ensure that everyone in this country and around the world understands that survivor safety is built on a foundation of equity, accessibility, housing, human rights, and economic empowerment. I appreciate you all making time to join us today. I know that what survivors and each of you are facing is incredibly daunting. Safe housing and access to housing is at the forefront of all of our work for survivors. There are shortages and challenges in every community across the country. Research continues to show that domestic violence is one of the leading causes of homelessness for families. FIPSA-funded grantees stretched their limited grants very far. In 2021, they provided over 7 million shelter nights, but still had over 181,000 unmet requests for shelter due to operating at full capacity and not having any open beds or resources to be able to shelter additional families. FIPSA-funded programs also responded to 2.5 million crisis calls and served over 1.3 million people. We know that the demands that you all are facing are huge, the needs are significant, and there are limitations to what is available in community. We are grateful for all of the work that you're doing to be able to stretch the existing resources, to be innovative, to be creative, and to continue to work very flexibly and collaboratively with other partners to try and meet these needs. This afternoon, I am joined by tremendous leaders from across the country that will help us learn more about meeting the needs of Black immigrant and refugee survivors and survivors from LGBTQ+ communities. We're grateful for today's presentations, and we can't wait to hear more from each of you about your important work. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your leadership. Thanks to the commitments of survivors and advocates and researchers and members of Congress and the President, we are now closer than we have ever been before to seeing the actualization of flexible funding for survivors and their children. The President continues to lead and request around flexible cash assistance. Members of Congress have reached out for technical assistance to understand what the proposal means. I think there's real opportunity because they're also hearing from each of you around how important having flexible options for survivors to help them shelter in place or to exit shelter very quickly and to have the flexibilities to be able to stabilize their families for 24 months or more is really, really important. The research continues to affirm that. Our colleagues in the Department of Justice and the HHS Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation recently released the Domestic Violence Housing First evaluation that reaffirms what we have known deeply, in terms of how to provide domestic violence housing first services that center survivors' needs, meet survivors' needs, and offers flexible support. That report is publicly available. There have been presentations far and wide across the country, and it helps bolster the important ask that is being made of this time to expand how we provide support to survivors in more substantive and flexible ways that help survivors have a continuum of options that are available to them in community. Yes, there is still work that needs to be done to actualize expanded resources for survivors, and also to continue to expand the important investments in the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. I, along with our entire FIPSA team, stand with you all in continuing to talk about the limitations of FIPSA funds, recognizing that the average grant for a local domestic violence program from FIPSA is $73,000 and $55,000 for tribes and tribal organizations. We know that those resources are stretched very thin. We know that more resources are needed to be able to meet those needs. And I really appreciate how hard you all are working in the face of so much to be able to be responsive and help survivors have a safe place to turn in their communities. Today, the National Resource Center has organized a very informative briefing that will help us continue to actualize change, to lift up needs, and make advancements for survivors. I hope that each of you come away from this session today with more information and research that will help you with your work. And I hope to hear from all of you about all the wonderful ways that you're continuing to be innovative, responsive, and use existing resources to be able to support survivors around housing and housing services. Thank you so much for joining us today. I look forward to hearing from you all, and I can't wait for the presentations ahead. I now turn things over to Allison Randall, the Principal Deputy Director of the Office of Violence Against Women. Allison?
Thank you so much, Shondell, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Allison Randall, she, her, hers. I'm a middle-aged white woman with sort of medium-length brown hair, a navy blue blazer, and a pink shirt. I'm so honored to be in the role I have at the Department of Justice, and so honored to be with all of you today, thinking about the impact, the importance of these innovative practices related to survivor safety. Right? How do we make real our commitments to housing, to racial equity, to financial security? And we deeply appreciate the chance to hear about the projects today that are taking such an intersectional approach to making real, tangible change. I travel the country multiple times each month, and every site visit, we hear about the need for housing. It is such a huge issue. That's why I came to DC, nearly 25 years ago, because I saw that lack of housing constantly trapping survivors, making it impossible to leave. When you don't have housing, you can't make real choices for your family or for yourself. Housing is truly crucial for safety, for stability, and also for access to justice. So at the Office on Violence Against Women, we have $700 million that we distribute in grants, and we change the world by supporting the incredible work that many of you all are doing right now. And through that, we prioritize racial equity. We prioritize doing that in an intersectional way that addresses the needs of survivors from all historically marginalized populations. We think about how do we improve access to justice for all survivors, however those survivors choose to define justice. To accomplish any of this, we have to expand economic justice. We have to do more financial advocacy for survivors. And we have to honor tribal sovereignty. That's something that cuts across all of our work. And I raise these priorities because, this is how we make tangible change at OVW, and why I think the work of Safe Housing Partnerships and the Safe Housing Capacity Center are so, so important. But, one challenge that we see that I'm sure you all are running into in the field are these crime-free lease programs and nuisance ordinances. These really punish survivors, and they work against every single one of our priorities, and it undermines our government-wide approaches and community approaches to addressing gender-based violence. In jurisdictions where these policies are in place, we know also that communities of color experience a disparate impact due to the broad definition of nuisance, the low threshold for enforcement, and the way that these get selectively enforced in some communities, but not in others. And while the intention is to reduce crime or make housing safer, these policies can really further isolate survivors. They introduce additional barriers to housing, and it means that survivors are less likely to ask for help, right? It reduces safety for everyone. It can also mean that landlords may refuse tenants if they think someone is a survivor of domestic violence. It may, further mar someone's rental history if they've been evicted due to this. And you can really be trapped, right, by damage to credit or by a problematic rental history. And again, that means that everyone is less safe. So when we think about how we expand access to justice, one of those key pieces is that, if survivors want to call the criminal justice system, want to call 911, that they can. And so many nuisance ordinances include calls to 911 as a nuisance, meaning that landlords sometimes evict survivors, for calling the police. Sometimes the rule is if you've called 911 3 times in a certain period, that's it, you're a nuisance. And the landlord, even if they don't want to, might have to evict that survivor because they're required to abate the nuisance by those local ordinances. We really appreciate the work that you all are doing on these issues, because being trapped between safety and remaining housed is impossible for survivors. That can be one of the things that force survivors to remain in shelters for a long period of time. The Violence Against Women Act of 2013 strengthened federal laws by, closing a key jurisdictional gap that left many American Indian and Alaska Native women without adequate protections, and by stopping some additional discrimination against domestic violence and sexual assault survivors in public housing. And the recent, just last year, Violence Against Women Act of 2022 made some key changes, including protecting the right of victims to seek assistance from their own homes to address criminal activity that's not their fault without risking eviction or penalties, helping to keep more folks housed. For those of you who do legal assistance, it also expanded the kind of legal assistance you can do. Eviction work has always been included, but now there's more on post-conviction relief, including vacatur and expungement. That's something that you can really use to help everyone access housing. I'll just close by noting we have a lot at OVW. If you are not funded by us, if you're interested, we got a lot more funding from Congress this year. So we have more available. We urge you to apply, particularly those of you who are culturally specific organizations, organizations that are by and for communities of color and underserved communities. We want to fund you. Reach out to us. And our transitional housing program is something that we fight for, and you can use it not just to provide hard units of housing, you can use it for rental assistance. You can use it really flexibly to respond to the needs of survivors. We also, for the first time, we're so excited, got a small amount of money, $4 million for direct financial assistance. We won't be able to roll that out for a few more months, so keep your eyes peeled, but direct financial assistance was also added as a purpose area in several Violence Against Women Act grant programs. Getting money directly to survivors to meet their needs, the things that they know they need to stay safe, right? Survivors know better than we do. So this, we think, is a huge priority, something we're excited to continue to work with Shondell and our colleagues about. We also have a research and evaluation solicitation open. It's open right now, so take a look at that. We have many priorities related to reaching underserved communities. We have a requirement that folks with lived experience help shape the research. Not just as participants, but help shape that research. So that closes at the end of June. Please take a look at that. And we hope to continue to collaborate with all of you, and with many thanks to my wonderful, brilliant, and talented colleague, Shondell Dawson. We look forward to fighting and standing shoulder to shoulder with all of you as we advance this work. Thank you so much to everyone. I am honored to pass the microphone to Funmi Ayeni, NRCDV's Director of Research and Evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Hello, everyone. My name is Oyeshola Oluwafumilayo Ayeni. I go by Funmi, and I am the Director of Research and Evaluation with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I use she, her pronouns. I am a Nigerian-American Black woman. My hair is black, it's in a straight bub cut, and I'm wearing a black shirt with red and white flower details. To get us started today, I will be introducing the Black Immigrant Housing Project. And so we commonly know that leave-in abusive relationships can be very difficult for victims and survivors of gender-based violence. But these difficulties are even greater for immigrants and women of ethnic minorities. Institutional racism, immigration regulations, cultural and religious differences, lack of cultural responsiveness, and a lack of diversity in frontline services are broadly challenges that present for immigrant survivors. Now, most of the studies in the US that have documented immigrant women's experiences of gender-based violence have not included the perspectives of immigrant women and Caribbean women, nor has it included the perspectives of direct service providers who work to support these populations. We also know that most studies have not documented the connection between gender-based violence, housing instability, and immigrant status among Black immigrants. And so, considering these realities, the Black Immigrant Housing Project was conceptualized to bring together survivors and experts from the community who work in the field of gender-based violence. The purpose of bringing this group together was to expand our thinking about what responsive programming, training, and technical assistance could look like at the intersection of housing instability and gender-based violence. And so specifically, this project that we have started will explore the nature and the extent of homelessness and housing insecurity among Black immigrant and refugee survivors. We will also document the experiences of advocates and direct service providers who are working with this population, also that we may better understand the intersections between housing instability and gender-based violence for this population. And so to introduce this project today, you will hear from some of our wonderful community partners who are culturally specific direct service providers working with Black immigrant survivors. Many of the insights they will share today are the information that is shaping the direction of this project. This project is ongoing, and we will continue to identify opportunities to share emergent findings with the field broadly as we continue to gather the information. So thank you all very much, and I will pass it on to Lavon Morris Grant, NRCDV's Director of Community Engagement, who will be facilitating this panel discussion today.
Thank you so much, Funmi. I so appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lavon Morris Grant. I am the Director of Community Engagements with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I am so honored to be here with you all and to be the facilitator of this panel. And as Funmi noted, we are doing an ongoing project and looking much forward to continuing the work and learning from the organizations that will be present on this panel today. So thank you all for being here with us. And as we move into the panel, as they begin to be spotlighted, that would be great. So we can start the facilitation of this and have a lengthy, open dialogue discussion with the women that will be coming on to work with us and for you all to meet. So thank you once again, and looking forward to what we all going to bring and what hopefully you all will be able to take away. So I will be introducing each person individually, and then we will get into our session of questions. So I will first start with Hajar, and she is the program director for the of the Community of Wellness for the Satu Yetu Center for African Women and Families. It's a multi-social agency whose mission is to mobilize low-income or no-income African immigrant women and their families to improve the quality of their lives, strengthen their families, and develop their communities in the United States, starting in New York City. So I love New York. That's one of my hometowns, coming from that area. So thank you, Hajar, for being here with us. And my next panelist I would like to introduce is Lil. She's the ED of the Person Center out of Washington, D.C. And they are dedicated to serving African immigrants as well in the refugee community in Washington, D.C. To honor the legacy of their late founder, Amelia, the mission of the Person Center is to provide holistic support to survivors of domestic and sexual violence. So I welcome you both and thank you for being here with us. And just want to dive into the questions, and thank you all for the wonderful listening sessions that we've had as of now, and those sessions will continue in the coming months. So thank you so very much. And let's see, Lil, I'm going to start with you. But before I start with you, I would like for you to just say hello or just say a word or two of what you would like to say.
Of course. Hello, everyone. My name is Lul Mahmoud, and I'm the Executive Director of the Person Center in Washington, D.C. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and a brief description of myself. I am a young-ish Black woman, light skin, with dark-rimmed glasses, also wearing a Black hijab and a white blouse. So I wanted to offer that first. I'm very excited to be able to be here to introduce the Person Center, but to also be able to contribute to this wonderful panel.
Thank you so much for that, Lil. And I have to introduce myself of a description. So thank you for that reminder for me to do that. I am an African-American woman. I'm gonna say I'm an elder. I'm just gonna leave it at that. I have, as far as my hair, I have a whole lot of hair today. It's curly and kinky, down to maybe shoulder length. I am a brown-skinned woman with some deep red lipstick and a gold chain, and I have on a multicolor top, if that's the best way I can describe it. I love showing up in multicolor. And so with that, before we move into the question, Lil, I would like to introduce our other panelists that's here with us. And Doris, so good to see you. Thank you. Thank you. And so Doris is the founder and CEO of the Imani Women's Center, located here in Clarkston, Georgia. And I say here because I'm located in Atlanta, Georgia, and have visited Doris's program several times. What an awesome program, where they provide culturally tailored programs and services that empower and contribute to the economic security, spiritual, mental, and physical well-being of refugee immigrant women. So hopefully I got all of that, all of that out. And as I said, as we proceed, we will introduce, you can say a little bit about yourself and then describe yourself as we get into the questions. So I will start with Lil first, as we got started originally. And Lil, this is a heavy hitter power type of question, I believe, but I know you can handle it and do your best in unpacking it within the 2 to 3 minutes. So, Lil, for you, and hopefully it'll be put in the chat for the audience because it is kind of a heavy hitter question. And so, Lil, was wondering, with your program, as you work with the African immigrant population, what financial, political, indoor, institutional barriers get in the way of your organization providing services to immigrant and refugee survivors of gender-based violence who are experiencing homelessness, indoor housing, instability, excuse me. So I know that was a lot, and I can repeat that if you need me to, but if that's okay, you can jump right in.
Of course, I can jump right into that. Thank you, Lavon, for the question. I think it's really important to first provide perspective on what our organization does when it comes to overcoming these obstacles that you mentioned, whether they're financial, whether they're political, whether they're even cultural at times. What our organization experiences is exactly what our survivors experience. So our organization was founded by and is led by a group entirely comprised of Black and African immigrant and first-generation American women. And so our work with our survivors is directly influenced by our own experiences as women of this community. And so when our survivors identify challenges with housing, particularly with housing instability, we recognize those challenges as ones we have to experience ourselves and we have to experience as an organization. So to offer a little bit more context, some of those challenges can include, for example, working with undocumented survivors, with the lack of work or opportunity for work authorization. Many of those individuals are underemployed. Even those who are documented are also underemployed. With the rising costs of housing and the difficulty of finding housing that could fit, for example, an entire family with children or other additional dependents, it is extremely difficult to find consistent housing that survivors are qualified for and can have proper credit checks and so on and so forth. But we also have the challenge of being able to maintain the costs of living. So as a support organization, our goal is to help survivors transition into independence. But the challenge is when the obstacles are so high and so many, the challenge is talking about sustainability, independent sustainability, becomes so much more difficult. And with many of our survivors, some of the challenges they also experience is keeping a job due to other issues, whether it's discrimination, whether it's incongruence with their lives or lifestyles, whether it's the fact that they're either overqualified because of credentials from back home, but are not able to use it here in the United States, lack of access to education or opportunities that could help them get to jobs or positions that could afford housing. The obstacles and the challenges are innumerable. There's many of them. And so what we are looking to do is to be as creative and innovative as possible, looking beyond typical housing options and being able to consider how can we get survivors and their families independent in a way that meets the other challenges they're experiencing. So housing has to be linked to proper economic solutions and support, as well as emergent financial solutions and long-term financial solutions. And that is something we have to do, especially as individuals who are also experiencing life as Black and African immigrant women. I hope that helps.
Very much, and I'm sure the audience will let us know how much that has helped based on if there'll be any questions. So thank you so much for that elaborate answer in such a short amount of time. I so appreciate how we have to do that. You did a great job. And moving to our next panelist, I would like to bring Hajar into the conversation. And same thing with you, Hajar, allow you to just say a little bit about yourself and your description as well before we get into the question.
Sure. Thank you, Lavon, for the introduction. I am a brown-skinned Muslim woman in my 30s. I'm wearing a cream headscarf with a floral border and a navy top.
All right, Hajar, thank you so much. And again, I am so honored to be in this space with you. And this next question, Hajar, is for you. And again, within that same two to 3 minute time frame, as much as we can, do that, right? So for you, Hajar, how does the lack of centering the experiences of Black immigrant and refugee survivors and immigrant and refugee, excuse me, I went to a whole nother question. How does the lack of housing options impact immigrant and refugee survivors' experience of gender-based violence?
Thank you. That's a great question. For us and at SOTIA2 and working with African immigrant women and their families, we know many of whom have children of varying ages. Without those suitable housing options, what that has meant is many times our clients may choose to remain at home. If they've been connected with us or connected with other organizations, they may have the benefit of, having a safety plan in place, having an emergency contact in place, but their life in terms of leaving or physically distancing themselves from the violence doesn't necessarily change once they're connected to us. Our hope is that through different services that we provide at SOTIA2 and that we can connect with other organizations here in New York City, but across the country, really. I think all of us do this work in tandem with one another, and we wouldn't be able to do it alone, certainly. But really our support comes in other forms. So, where housing isn't available, maybe folks need legal support. Maybe folks need access to work authorizations. It's possible that there are other avenues that we can support them with. For example, getting folks insured and access to healthcare coverage. We know that looks very different across the country. Even something as simple as women's health services. So there are other ways that we are integral in supporting our community members when they can't necessarily leave the household, which is still very unfortunate. And we hope that can always be an option that we provide to clients. But as I think everyone has noted so far, the lack of the housing options or funding or rental assistance is what makes it so difficult for folks to leave. And they're not able to really make meaningful change. And for us, it's really recognizing that where they currently are, there may be further harm or threat of violence in many different forms. And so our support has to look, as Lil said, we have to be very innovative and quick on our feet to think of how we can better support our community members without, best case scenario, we can take them to another safe space and provide them that housing or the assistance that they need. But what are those services, the other services that we can provide as a social support in the interim is really what we work to offer.
Thank you, Hajar. I love how you weaved in that you all will provide what we call wraparound services, right? That we all have to figure out how to do. particularly at our culture-specific programming, and those services can look so different from mainstream, particularly when it comes to, different types of spirituality or religions and things like that, and food, right? So thank you for adding those services. And we give that name the wraparound services. So thank you for that. And last but not least, as we continue with our great discussion, and I really hope you all are taking this in and really making note of the work that these organizations and the women that serve these organizations are doing, because they are doing a tremendous job with lack of services or resources. So every time I meet with them, I'm always so honored and enthralled of how they are making it work. So as I was saying, we have Doris with us here, which I'm always happy to see you, Doris. Thank you for being with us. And as I introduce Doris, as I did about being the founder of Imani Center, I will allow Doris to do the same, have a few words of description, and then get into the questions. You on mute, Doris. Still not hearing you. Let's see what's happening.
It should work now, no?
It's not working still, Doris? So I don't have the capacity to take you off mute. So I'm not sure. She's unmuted, but I'm not sure why her sound. Is the sound up on your computer, Doris?
It's always frustrating, but you may need to leave and come back, Doris.
Oh, goodness.
I don't know if that's the answer, but sometimes that helps.
So Doris, I know we've been having some issues, but just if we can do that, and we'll jump right back into you once you get back, and I'll just move to the next question, and then we'll come back to you once you come back. So technology is good when it is, and when it's not, it's just what it is. So thank you, Doris. Sorry for that. But you know what? Just because we have techie issues, it don't mean we have issues, right? Because we can still control this space and be okay in this space, and have everybody give us grace and bear with us as we continue to move forward with some really, really great information that I think will help shape the field's perspectives on how we work with the Black immigrant communities, right? Right. So Lil, I'm going to come back to you with the next question as we hopefully get Doris back and continue to make this a great space, Lil. So let's see what I have for you, Lil. Can you share with us what factors lead to persistent and repetitive homelessness or housing instability among immigrant and refugee survivors of gender-based violence?
So this is also a really great question. And we could definitely be sitting here for a while going through the different factors that can happen, because the reality is that every case is different, as we all know as service providers, and the experiences of each survivor is different, and it can also be different in different time periods. So some of the challenges, the factors I would say that contribute to this, first and foremost, we mentioned earlier, is lack of financial resources. So for example, with rent increases, or with, for example, underemployment or employment instability, there could be challenges with just being able to make your rent. Other issues also include where we have survivors who, due to their undocumented status, are living have homes where they live there, but they're not on a proper lease, so they don't have any tenants' rights or whatnot. And as a result, landlords can take advantage of that. And at any point, they can lose their housing and be threatened with homelessness. And unfortunately, in some cases, survivors who are survivors of different forms of violence, abuse, or trauma, they're often also exploited. So exploited by their employers, exploited by their landlords. Some other factors that can contribute also includes discrimination that survivors do experience. So many of our survivors are labeled as difficult. Many of them are not given the grace or the acceptance or the kindness or the patience that many survivors do need in terms of challenges that they're experiencing. And it really is, as a survivor, without the proper support, that period after leaving an abusive relationship and moving towards, independence and stability, it's a very transient period. So a lot can happen in that time. Where, for example, we have survivors of many children. Those children, the challenges may happen where they may be required to move to a different place, but won't be able to afford that change. There are also other factors that also that play a part in this. Also includes survivors in need of a need for community, a sense of community. And so when there are housing options, but they're far from where they may work, from where they may pray, from where they may find community or understanding, that may not be ideal overall. They may have a roof over their head, but it causes additional stress and challenges. And so at times, survivors will take their chances and move to a different place or try their best to stay where they're located. These are just a few examples of factors that play into it. And it really ranges from case specific, but also to structural inequities and challenges. And so sometimes when it just comes to being that term eligibility, it can really come out and bite you out of nowhere. And so some survivors may lose access to the balancing acts that they're doing with other forms of assistance. And if one form of assistance disappears, it may affect all the others. So we have cases where a survivor may have daycare so that they can go to their job, so that they can pay for rent in their new home, that can maintain their family. And let's say that daycare is taken away from them. That could be a family friend or a family member or someone. Then they're not able to finish to work. Then they are at risk of losing their job. Then they are losing their housing. So it's really a balancing act. If you've ever seen those acts where it's like they're spinning plates on sticks, it really is like that for survivors, where it's not only are they are facing the challenge of experiencing trauma and the mental health impacts of it over the mental and physical health impact, but they're also trying to manage all of these different factors at the same time. And too many of these factors are outside of their hands and outside of their control, but they're expected to control it all and to figure it all out. And many times when they reach out for assistance or support, they could reach out to the quote unquote, people, support systems that are not very supportive for them, that don't recognize their experiences, that don't understand the factors they're dealing with. And so many survivors would say, I'd rather take my chance on my own than to reach out to someone that may make it more difficult or won't understand me or add insult to injury.
Right. And Lil, as we know, right, all of what you brought in, we know is even more, is even greater for survivors, particularly when we look at the mental stability or instability, right, of the triggering traumas that continue. Because I definitely remember when I was out there and the balancing act that we talk about, when one doesn't work, we try something else and everything falls apart, all the balls, start falling. And the last thing I remember prior to my incident, that we didn't call it this back then, but I was going to self-traffic myself sexually. That wasn't the name back in the 90s, but I needed a vehicle, and this particular predator was interested in me and let me know he was interested in me and would help me if I did X, Y, Z. Like he didn't spell it out, but we know what it was.
It's exploitation. So what that's why I mentioned it. Our survivors become extremely vulnerable to exploitation from their landlords, from their bosses, from anyone and everyone. And at times there's also emotional exploitation that occurs with people who are supposed to be helping them by saying, well, if you say that, this actually happened, or if you, don't make it so difficult for yourself, or just like choose to live somewhere that's disparate from everything, just because you said you needed housing, just accept it. And a lot of our survivors are kind of in essence lowballed and told to be grateful for resources that don't work or meet their needs. And so when a survivor then chooses to not select something that's beneath their dignity, then they're left to suffer.
Right. And other things can happen. I know, for me, as we move into Doris, and we're glad to have you back, Doris, and making that decision, or I didn't get a chance to make the decision because unfortunately, my husband, who was my other perpetrator, tried to kill me by shooting me 4 times, and my children witnessing that. So then a whole another plethora of issues arose, right, in deeper trauma. So I think when we talk about this, right, from our lived experiences, working with survivors and those of us being survivors ourselves, I don't think people fully realize what we have to go through when we are going through it. It's easy for people to talk about it, about our experiences, but when you are actually living the experience and trying to juggle all of that and almost being killed in the process, right? I don't think people fully get when we say we really do need these resources, right? And we're not just asking for the sake of asking, like most times these resources are considered a life or death for us, right, in that moment. And so I think people need to walk away with that understanding when we are working in community and populations and trying to decrease as many issues as possible. So with that, that leads me into the work that Doris is doing here in Clarkston, Georgia. And welcome back, Doris. And I'm hoping our techie issues are solved. So say hello, Doris. Let's make sure.
Hello.
All right, there you go. There's that beautiful voice. Yes. See, technology is good when it's good. So Doris, I will give you the opportunity for your description and as we move into the question for you. So thank you for coming back and being patient with us.
Thank you for being patient with me. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. To partake in such an important discussion. I'm Doris Mukangu, originally from Kenya, East Africa, and I am rocking an handmade Ethiopian scarf, hand woven, a gray shawl, and my favorite amethyst stone, copper. Wrapped in copper. I think that's it.
Well, thank you, Doris, for rocking your Ethiopian scarf. I really appreciate it. It is so beautiful. I got to get back to your program so I can get me some more handmade items.
Come on over.
So with that, Doris, as we lead into our next session of questions, can you briefly share about the work your organization and the population communities that you are serving? And Doris, please tell us like how many in that particular area, because that was so mind-blowing to me.
Yes. So Amani Women's Center is based in Clarkston, Georgia, which is known to be the most diverse square mile in the United States. Over 60 languages are spoken in Clarkston. It's becoming, we're adopting it to be the Ellis Island of the South. In this little space, there's so much diversity, and with diversity comes unique challenges. And so with unique challenges come unique solutions. So our center sees women from all over mostly from Africa. I can name Congo, Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, Rwanda, Burundi. Whew, I tell you, there are so many. I can't even remember everyone, but it looks like the United Nations in there. We have so much diversity, and yes, so that's what the location we work in looks like, very diverse. Our community looks like I mentioned, is very diverse. Our services and programs are focused on helping mostly women, of course, and with women, that means you're helping families, children and husbands, we focus, we're mostly known for our economic empowerment program. And I like that Lul touched on that, and she mentioned, linking housing to economic empowerment. I mean, when we talk about sustainability, you have to link those two together, sustainable solutions. So yeah, I think that's, again, I can't stress enough the idea of a holistic approach. I like, that Hager mentioned the wraparound services. There's no way you can work in these unique communities without having a holistic approach in catering to a survivor who walks through your doors, because the challenges are layered, and we have to get creative in figuring out how to address all those layers of challenges.
Wow, Doris, thank you so much. I just have a quick question, Doris, and we'll get into our last question, as I know our panel is coming to an end, and I hate that. I hate that, because I feel like we're just getting started and getting into the meat. But Doris, when you talk about your economic empowerment program, can you just tell us a little bit more about, what that entails and how that works, right? And how the women respond to it?
Yes. So we recognized in working with women in our community, we were offering band-aid solutions when we were just responding to their immediate needs. And we wanted to figure out how to address the root causes of, all sorts of issues that we're facing. And we came up, as a result of listening and having those community conversations with the women, heard them say that they need, first of all, a safe space to come to learn skills that would empower them to be self-sustainable. And there existed no safe space, that they felt comfortable showing up and being themselves, just showing up as yourself and feeling accepted. If you're covered, if you're not covered, if you have an accent, if you can't articulate yourself, just finding a space that you can come to and feel welcomed. And in that space, what Amani is, you come there to learn a sewing skill, and this sewing skill empowers you to, after graduating or after getting that sewing skill, you're able to get into the workforce. So there's workforce development. And when you get into the workforce, you enter the workforce earning livable wages. And so they can start off with, as much as $18 per hour with a skill. So the skills are so important for these women. And it's a skill that they will have for the rest of their lives. This is a skill that even empowers them to work from their homes. For those who have children and they cannot make it to work, they start home-based businesses, and so, we're excited about this, because not only are we offering this opportunity to come and learn a skill, at the center, we are offering you financial literacy classes. We're offering ESL classes. We're helping you tap into social services that are available for you. Rental assistance, utility assistance, figuring out how to, address those barriers. How do you put in an application if you're technically challenged? You have technologically challenged. You have no idea how to do that. So our team is here to hold your hand and figure out those barriers, and how to address those barriers. And so, a woman may walk into our space saying, hey, I just want to join the sewing program. but we quickly find out that maybe she's in a domestic violence situation. And so how do we help address that? What resources are available? And so it's all about relationships and building those relationships, and there's trust, and, you know, again, holding your hand until you're on your own 2 feet. And that's what the Amani Women's Center is doing for these women.
Wow, Doris, thank you. Thank you. I knew there was more to that economic justice empowerment work that you all are doing. And I just really wanted others to know about that there are different ways to help women find and sustain their economic justice work, right? So particularly financially, right? Thank you so much for that. As we move into our panel and coming to an end, I'm going to ask this last question, and it's for everyone. And the person I'm going to start with is Hajar, and then we'll move along. And I will repeat the question if you need me to, so don't feel you know, like, oh God, I don't remember. It's okay, because we in this together, right? We in this together, and we can repeat stuff. So Hajar and my other community partners, the question is, how does the lack of centering the experiences of Black immigrant and refugee survivors in immigrant and refugee focused discussions efforts contribute to service barriers and the lack of understanding about the needs of this population?
So I think throughout this conversation, we may have touched on this a little bit, but I'll highlight some of the unique challenges I think that persist when working particularly with Black immigrants. I will have to start with the that we really do a disservice for our community members when services and resources and support is not provided and doesn't recognize that, for example, Black immigrants are not a monolith. And so they come from many different parts of the world. They come at many different stages in life, and languages and cultures and faith and all of these systems that make up who they are, makes it so that in a way our work needs to be unique and meet folks where they are. As Lou, I think so eloquently mentioned before, when you miss that and you try and interact with well, this is a Black person, with all of the assumptions and all of the misconceptions and all of they're already battling that elsewhere. They cannot come to our spaces and also continue that battle. And when that does happen, unfortunately, is when those same folks who need help, and as many of you touched on, it's life or death for some folks, they will not reach out for services again. They will not go back and try and seek help. It already took so much for our survivors to take that first step to ask for help. We know, I'm sure as Black women, that we can just handle it all and just take it all, and to work through that pride and, you know, that sense of responsibility and all of these roles that we play to finally ask for help and then be met with services and systems that do not assist and maybe cause further harm, really puts our community members, our survivors at more risk. There is also a sense of, you know, of pride of being from a particular country or particular, you know, I'm a proud Muslim woman. I want to share that. I want to make sure that I practice that. And I want to make sure that as the services that I'm getting are congruent to that and help me hold those values, uphold those values in my life as I continue seeking services. So we touched on the challenges that are already there. I think exploitation is a big one. And I will add this, there are also unique challenges, gender-based violence and intimate partner violence and issues that come up for Black immigrant communities that may not be as prevalent in other communities. And without that knowledge, without that understanding that forced marriage is a possibility without understanding, or child marriage, or female genital cutting, and these are unique challenges our community members are going to face, along with all the other legal issues, language barriers, everything else that's going on. And so with this, the challenges are really stacked up high. But we have to understand that, and we have to know our community members. We have to take the time for each individual that comes in to really understand what they've lived through, what they're hoping to get past and build, and all of that is for them to build their independence. And it can't look as, the same from one person to the next. And so we want to make sure that we highlight that there's still that diversity within the community, and our services need to also be there to meet those needs, as well as, our family makeup may be one mom, and, I think the average right now in our communities is like 5 children. So how do we meet that need? We cannot provide them a shelter space for one parent and 2 children. It's not, it doesn't meet their needs.
Right. The needs continue to be so complex, right? As we all continue to figure out how to meet those specific types of needs. And so as we move along in our closeout time, Doris, I'm going to come to you with the same question. I'm going to repeat it, okay? Just so we all on the same page of where we at. So how does the lack of centering the experiences of Black immigrant and refugee survivors in immigrant and refugee focused discussions, efforts contribute to service barriers and a lack of understanding about the needs of this population?
Thank you for that question, Lavon. I'm glad that Hager touched a lot on service delivery and what that looks like if we look at Black and immigrant communities as a homogeneous situation, so I would like to take it a step further, or to take it from a different angle and talk about funding and how limiting funding, how using a lens that is looking at our population from a homogeneous perspective leads to limited funding, because now we are not taking it into consideration that we need to tailor programming and services to fit the various ethnicities or different racial, ethnicities. So when there's no information out there of the different needs that exist in the different communities, then the funding again is bundled up, and so it becomes very limited, and so access to funding, becomes a challenge for us. The other thing I want to mention is research as well. So if research is conducted in such a manner that, we're just looking at this community as a monolith, like Hager mentioned, again, we're missing so much of the nuances that exist in the various cultures, and then missing the opportunity to address all those issues, the various issues that exist in the different communities. So an example I can think of is when we are looking for maybe housing solutions for a victim or a survivor, and she mentions she wants to be in an area where she has access to a masjid, but no one is thinking, let's make sure that we have housing opportunities available close by to a house of worship, for folks who want to have access to that. So, yeah, this is such an important question, and it needs to be teased out and, and addressed from various angles to meet the unique needs in a unique population. Thank you.
Wow, Doris, yeah. And I'm sure as I get to Lil, we can keep adding more layers, right? And hopefully as we continue, we'll be able to decrease some of these layers as we get the resources and the financial funding that is so needed, right? And so, Lil, I'm not sure if you need me to repeat the question, but I'm believing based on knowing you have pretty much your answer already set. So we'll just go ahead and move right into you and then come to our closeout, or if there are any Q&A at the end of this.
Thank you so much, Lavon. And thank you, Doris and Hajar. Honestly, just phenomenal community leaders and advocates. This question is really important because I think what we really need in service provision in particular, as well as research, is a mindset change. And it really begins with recognizing our internalized discrimination, as well as the stigma that we have surrounding African immigrants, but Black immigrants as a total. First, if we look at our data in terms of service provision as well as utilization rates, we are constantly being told, oh, this community doesn't use the resources. They don't use the resources. They tell us they have a problem, but they don't use the resources. That narrative is putting the blame on the community that you allegedly are trying to serve. This is a very common phenomenon when it comes to advocating for our community. They are treated as though they are the problem, and that for them not fitting into the resources that were created without them in mind is a problem that that this community has. And that is absolutely it's a convoluted idea around the community, but it makes sense because it aligns with colonial and discriminatory perspectives of this community. So I want to start there. The next thing I really want to highlight is that when we are working with a community that has historical experiences with violence and oppression and harm, and then when they come to the United States, living in the United States, if they are supposed to turn to, for example, law enforcement, which is the typical, that still remains one of the major resources that are provided, you're asking a community to navigate a criminal legal system that deems them as criminal before victim. And then we have survivors that are in need of immigration support and services. But then when they turn to the immigration system, or look to get support within the system, quote unquote, following the good way, or the way that everyone should, they're being treated as alien before they're treated as individuals. And so and those are just two examples. We don't even need to discuss economic. We don't need to discuss medical. Where every single one of these within these systems, people from the Black immigrant community are given the short stick, and the short stick in this analogy is usually violence, discrimination, and additional harm. And so as a result, the community has naturally become insular, trusting only those they know and that have built credibility with them. So as service providers, it is our responsibility to build credibility with this community, to build trust, and to measure success using trust as the primary indicator, instead of measuring the community and blaming them for not utilizing resources that never had them or their community in mind. So if your shelter limits mothers with 2 or 3 children, doesn't include other dependents, doesn't include other individuals in this family that could be, for example, we have survivors that are caretakers of their family's children, for example. They may have a sibling who's passed on, but they are taking care of that sibling's child. If that child doesn't count as their child, they're not going to your shelter. They are not going to turn to you. If you are asking for invasive screening questions that reminds the survivor, for example, of what it was like getting into the country, living within a refugee camp, they don't want to go through that again as their natural instinct. And so when they don't use your resources, it is not a condemnation of the community. It is a wake-up call for you to reassess your resources and the different criteria you are setting, which were developed on a community that is nothing like them. So it's really important, as we talk life or death, our survivors need to be given the respect and understanding before they are being condemned for not using resources that were never meant for them to use. And so it's really important for service providers, for funders, for anyone and everyone who says they are opening their resources to all people to do the work, and to do the work internally and externally. Internally meaning reviewing your staff, your hiring practices, your training protocols. Externally, means working with the community and building trust first and foremost, and not believing because they have it hard enough that they should come running to us. You should be where they are and proving that they can trust you and utilize your resources, because they are showing their most vulnerable selves by saying that they need help. And too often they've done that before and have had the door slammed in their face or cuffs put onto their wrists. So it's very, very important that we are working on reorienting our perspectives for the lives of our survivors in the Black immigrant community.
All right. I knew as we went up the ladder, more and more would get added. You all did such a fantastic job. And again, like I said, I'm so sorry we have to end at this part of the agenda, but it was so open and so wide, and I'm hoping our audience will be able to take a whole lot from this. And as your last words, Lil, to change their perspectives and be willing, if not change, at least be willing to be open to different perspectives, right? As you begin the process of change. So as we bring this to an end, it's not the end for us, but it's the end for this moment. Thank you, Haja. Thank you, Doris. Thank you, Lil, for your time and participation and for all the energy that you gave us and shared with our breadth of audience. So I am so honored to be a part of this and to have been able to facilitate this session. So as I move us along, I will now pass it back to my colleague, Funmi.
Thank you so much, Lavon. Hi again, everyone. My name is Funmi Ayeni, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Research and Evaluation with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I am a Black woman. I'm wearing short, bob cut Black hair, and I have on a shirt that's Black with floral red and white details. And so today I am so excited to share with you some of our findings from our flexible funding pilot project that we conducted in partnership with the LGBT Center on Central Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. So to give you an overview of what we will discuss today, I will start by providing just an overview of the purpose of this study, and then I'll talk about the guiding principles of flexible funding. And then we'll get to really digging into what did we do with this process evaluation, and then I will conclude with an in-depth review of what we found, what our emergent findings were. But before I go into those details, I do think it's important for me to acknowledge that flexible financial assistance, while it may be a new conversation that we're having today, is not an innovation. So we know that Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities have been implementing the practices associated with flexible financial assistance for many years. And so culturally specific organizations have been working in their communities with historically marginalized groups, and they have a long history of using flexible funds to support the needs of survivors. And so while this is not innovative in practice, it is an initiative that is starting to gain national popularity, particularly amongst mainstream processes. And so I am excited to talk more about it as we continue to further the work on this flexible funding assistance model. Next slide, please. And so to move the process forward of conducting research and evaluation on flexible financial assistance, we decided to conduct this process of evaluation, and we did so to really document what it takes for a community-based organization to implement this model. And we also were seeking to contribute to the evidence on the effectiveness of this model for multiply marginalized communities, which in this particular instance refers to Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, as well as LGBTQ+ identifying youth. Next slide, please. And so just to start by giving a brief overview of what the flexible funding model is, when we talk about flexible funding assistance, we're talking about financial support that is provided to survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault with the intention of addressing any barriers that stand in their way of securing safe, permanent, accessible, and affordable housing. And so when we think about flexible funding, it's really important to recognize that there is a bidirectional relationship between domestic violence and housing stability. And we know that the negative impacts of various forms of violence, including economic violence, can significantly limit the ability of survivors to secure stable housing. And more recently, we've seen from research evidence how emergency financial assistance is in fact beneficial to survivors. And so, for example, the recently concluded Domestic Violence Housing First evaluation model, which really looked into how flexible financial assistance, which is one of the components of the DVHF model, supports survivors in securing stable housing. And through that study, it was found that flexible funding can actually increase the housing stability among survivors. And so taking all of this evidence together, there truly continues to be increases in the ways that we conceptualize what flexible funding can look like in communities and how important it is for many communities, particularly historically marginalized communities. And so when we think about the implementation of flexible funding, it's really important to think about what are the guiding principles that guide that process. And so we've identified 4 that we're sharing with you all today, first being survivor-driven advocacy. And what that really looks like is highlighting the importance of that survivor-advocate relationship, where advocates listen to survivors, they affirm survivors, and then they work closely with them to adequately respond to their needs. And part of this advocacy is recognizing that flexible funding is not a resource that should be provided in isolation. It truly is a resource that should complement the existing core services. And so ongoing advocacy for survivors is essential when implementing flexible funding. Now, this will differ depending on what the survivor's needs are and what their wants are. However, it is strongly recommended that advocates engage in safety planning before, during, and after providing flexible financial assistance to survivors. And then the next principle that I'll talk about is the fact that flexible funding should be low barrier access. And what we mean by that is that it really should be made available to survivors with little or no prerequisites, requirements for supporting documentation, or even asking that they be engaged in any services before they can receive those funds. And then flexible funding should also support multiple needs, and there shouldn't be any limitations on the funding amount that survivors can receive, the frequency of the funding, and how it's given to them. And we do this because we recognize that survivors are going to have varying needs at various points in time. And so while one survivor may only need financial assistance at one time and may only need a specific amount, another survivor may need multiple supports over time, whether that's a short period of time or a longer period of time, and they may also need a larger amount. And then finally, flexible funds should in fact be promptly dispersed. And so what we mean by that is we want to see these funds go out as swiftly as possible to survivors, ideally within 24 to 48 hours, because it should be an emergency response. And so it's really important that when implementing flexible funding, those funds can be immediately released to survivors as soon as they ask for it. Next slide, please. And so before I talk about the evaluation process, I will mention that while we've talked about what flexible funding is, and we've talked about the guiding principles of flexible funding, it's important to acknowledge that there are various restrictions that are set by funding sources that may impact the ability of direct service providers to implement flexible funding in complete alignment with the principles of the model. And it's part of what informed our decision to conduct an evaluation so that we can further uncover and discuss what those challenges look like. But while those challenges exist and they are real, it is important that these principles that I mentioned are foundational to our philosophy and that we use them in our practice, even as we continue to advocate for the removal of administrative barriers that might impact the use of grant funds very flexibly. And so for our pilot project, we conducted this between August and December of 2022. And what that looked like was the policy and research team that included the evaluation team members worked really closely with the advocates at the LGBT Center throughout the duration of the project. We first had some initial conversations just to talk about what the model is, think through the resources that would be needed, and then provided ongoing support and continue to have more conversations as the project was implemented. Now, with the importance of having those initial conversations and the ongoing support is because we had to make sure that the principles of the flex funding model were present in the implementation process. And we also had to make sure that we continued to be a resource to the center for when any challenges or issues came up that they needed to discuss with us. And so to gather information on how this project was being implemented and how it was working to support the participants of the project, we collected data. What that data looked like was taking a flexible funding tracker that included questions such as demographic information, how much money people were requesting, what they were indicating they wanted to use those funds for, when it was dispersed, and then also some information on what the immediate impact of those funds would be for participants. And then we also had in-depth interviews with the two advocates who were primarily responsible for managing this program so that we could better learn from their perspective how it was to implement this and what they were starting to hear in terms of how the work was supportive for survivors. Next slide, please. And so our evaluation documented some of the challenges that participants experienced broadly, such that many of the youth who were served through this program had experienced various forms of abuse and hardship, including violence at home. And when advocates talked to us, they discussed the prevalence of homelessness among the youth, which often would stem from strained relationships with family members due to disagreements and disapprovals because of the youth's gender and/or sexual identity. And then the advocates also discussed the relationship between homelessness and exposure to violence, such that a lot of the youth, because they were left home, they were on the streets, actually had an increased risk of experiencing violence, also had increased risk of experiencing sexual violence, domestic violence, and also in that instance, were engaging in survival sex work, which means that they were also at an increased risk for experiencing HIV, exposure to HIV. And so the center is also located in Harrisburg. So another issue that came up was this problem of inadequate transportation. Now, considering the ways in which Harrisburg, Pennsylvania is structured, the advocates really talked about how it was difficult for a lot of the youth to navigate transportation issues, especially when they were working on places that were outside of the city limits and didn't have really good mass transit support in that area. And then they also talked about how it was difficult for a lot of the youth to maintain reliable transportation because of the lack of safety in many of the neighborhoods in which they lived. Next slide, please. And so next, I'll share briefly how the agency implemented the flex funding process. And so first, participants were informed of the financial support that was available mainly through word of mouth. And so what that looked like was advocates would share about the assistance available in their informal interactions and conversations with participants. Now, the organization also had a youth advisory board, and that board served to disseminate information about this resource to participants. And then the advocates also noted that there were instances where participants who had benefited from the resource would then tell other participants who would approach the advocates for more support. Next slide, please. And so when we're thinking about the ways in which they implemented the flex funding process, it is important to note first that the agency was in fact providing some housing and financial support to clients through other funding sources before we started the flex funding pilot project. And so while they were dispersing those funds, they had a process in place where participants who were requiring anything over $200 were asked to complete an application and provide supplemental documentation. And so when we came in to implement this flexible funding model, which is really a core principle is removing any barriers, there had to be some changes to the process. So initially the process went something like this, where the advocate would identify the need for funding support through conversations with the participant. And then if the funds were more than 200 being requested, the participant would be asked to complete a supplemental material, provide supplemental materials to complete an application, and then the payment would be dispersed either to or on behalf of the participant. And if it wasn't more than $200 that they were requesting, it would just be directly dispersed. So to align with flex funding principles, several adjustments were made to the policies, some of which included the removal of that formal application process and removal of the request for supplemental documentation. Next slide, please. And so in terms of how funds were dispersed through multiple ways. The most common method that was used in this pilot was direct payments that were made by the agency to third parties on behalf of the survivors. And that accounted for about 77% of the disbursements. And so that included making payments to landlords, making payments to institutions, to merchants, or any other service providers. And then merchant gift cards like DoorDash, Instacart, and Uber were also provided directly to participants. And the least common method of disbursement that was used included Visa gift cards and direct payments that were made to participants, and that only accounted for about 7%. So we also, next slide, please. So we also sought to document the length of time that disbursements took. And we found that it ranged from same day, 1 day payments to 20 days after the requests were made. Now, most of the disbursements were made within 1 day. So that accounted for about 80% of the disbursements, and just very few were made within 2 to 5 days, and about 1 or 2 were made longer, and that was because they were using checks, which took longer to process. Next slide, please. And so who was part of our study? So about 30 participants received funding through this pilot project. And of those 30 participants, more than half actually disclosed personal experiences of domestic violence and experience with witnessing violence in the home. And then when we think about the composition of age, we had participants who ranged between 18 to 36 years old. Most of our participants identified as Black and Latinx, that accounted for a whopping 97%. 10 of our 30 participants identified as transgender. 7 of them reported that they had children, and only 3 shared that they were immigrants or refugees. Next slide, please. And so in terms of how funds were distributed, I had mentioned earlier that this project lasted between August and December. And so funds were actually dispersed between August and November. And so starting off in August, there were about 17 participants who were served. Funds were dispersed a total of 25 times. And the highest amount received in any one payment made to or on behalf of the participants was $1,800. And so we see a similar pattern in September. So we served of just a few less survivors, 14 participants, but we see an uptake in the number of times funds were dispersed, about 42 times. And we also see an increase in the amount of money that was dispersed at one time, which is 2,500. And then in October, we're seeing similar patterns of 15 participants who were served. Funds were dispersed 35 times, and the highest amount received in any one payment was $2,250. And finally, in November, 12 participants were served. Funds were dispersed a total of 25 times, and the highest amount that was dispersed at any one time was $1,920. And now I'll mention that the number of times that funds were dispersed comprised of survivors or participants who received funds one or more times, which means one participant could have received funds multiple times or could have received funds one time. Next slide, please. And so in total, we were able to disperse a little over $36,000. And we dispersed that ranged between about $8 to $2,500 for each unique disbursement that was made. And when we think about sort of the number of participants, total amount of money that was received by each participant, it ranged from $50 to as high as $4,894. I will note again that there were no restrictions placed on the number of times that participants could receive funding or the amount that participants could receive at any time. So this was truly in response to the need that participants identified. Next slide, please. And so a total of 127 payments were made. So that's the total number of times that funds were dispersed, either to or on behalf of the participants. And for each person who was a part of this study, they received funding 1 to 15 times, right? So that's the number of unique payments that we made, either to or on behalf of each of the participants. Next slide, please. And so we also looked at what people were spending some of this monies on. And I will note that, this is solely based off of the self-report. And we took no steps to ask for any sort of supplemental documentations or anything to verify what people accounted that they spend money on. But through conversations with the advocates, participants reported spending money on the following categories. So there are more categories that the participants reported spending money on, but these were the highest categories that I'm sharing with you all today. And so the first being transportation. And so funds were dispersed related to transportation a total of 51 times. And that included things like people needing to get gas in their car, people needing to get a new car, needing to replace car parts, car repairs, all of that was considered under transportation, also taking Uber, getting from one place to another. The second highest category in terms of the number of times that funds were dispersed were basic needs. Third being rent and mortgage assistance. We also saw high numbers for emergency hotel stay, as well as supporting move-in costs and deposits and household utilities and other bills. Next slide, please. And so in terms of the total amount of funds that were dispersed per category, we saw the highest amount being dispersed to cover rental and mortgage assistance, which is no surprise considering the sustained housing need and need for housing support in this population. We also saw that for move-in costs and deposit, that was the second highest category, where a total of like 13% of the total funds went towards covering those costs. While transportation had the highest number of times funds were dispersed, as I presented in the last slide, we actually just saw 11% of the total amount of funds go towards transportation, followed by basic needs, emergency hotel stays, and then general debt assistance. Again, as a reminder, these are not the only categories that funds were dispersed to cover. These are just the top 6 that I'm sharing. And the report of that summarizes all of the findings of this study, includes a longer list of all the categories, the amount spent, the number of times payments were made related to each category, and a description of what is included or what is considered as a cost in each of the categories. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that flexible funding, a principle of flexible funding is survivor-driven advocacy. And so in this context, what that meant was other services were being provided and offered to the participants who received flexible funding. And a total of 67 participants received additional services. Those services included things like HIV and STI testing, case management, support with completing housing applications, and food and hygiene pantry. They also received some other supports which are noted in the full report. Next slide, please. And so we also wanted to document how effective was it to provide this emergency financial assistance resource to the participants. And we were able to get some preliminary evidence of this model's effectiveness for the population served. Now, specifically, we saw that 68% of the participants were able to remain stably housed, which means that they were able to move from one like rental housing to another, or moved from one home to another, but they remained stably housed. We also saw that 67% reported that they experienced an increase in their well-being. So a lot of the particular funds that were provided to them went towards supporting one or more aspects of their well-being. And so that was documented. And finally, we saw 26% actually be able to move from homelessness to temporary or permanent housing. What that looked like was survivors who actually had no housing being able to secure some rental housing. We saw survivors move from having no housing to being able to afford some emergency hotel stay, and then seeing those who were in emergency hotels being able to move to securing their own rental housing unit. Next slide, please. And then through our in-depth conversations with the advocates, we also wanted to document what they were seeing in terms of the impact of this funds on the outcomes of survivors and participants. And so this is one of the quotes from the advocates interviewed about how this pilot program impacted housing. They say, I worked with one family, they were a trans man, a transgender man, a cisgender woman, and they had 6 kids. They were in a pretty bad position here in Harrisburg. They came to the center, they filled out an emergency housing application. They talked to us about where they wanted to go. They were saying that they didn't think Harrisburg was just right for them. They found a place through a friend in West Virginia, and we were able to cover the cost of a moving truck, rent, and security deposit to get them down there. So this is just an example of the ways in which the emergency funds that were provided was able to support not just the recipient of the funds, but their entire family, and was able to help them move from an environment that was unsafe to access safety. Next slide, please. And then we also have a quote here from our advocates on the impact of well-being. And so here is noted that they're seeing less shame, more ownership and excitement about what the participants are working on. And I think that's just human pride. They think, okay, you might be covering my rent this month, but guess what? This time next month, I'll have the check from this job and that job, and I'll be able to cover my rent. Just knowing that one thing is going to be taken care of allows people to free up space in their mind to dream, plan, and work towards a goal. Next slide, please. And so finally, I'm sharing a quote about how this impacted the participants' safety. And this advocate said, these are individual autonomous people with their own thoughts, goals, plans, and we're able to support them on those missions. And the Flex funding has been an instrumental tool in making that possible. Not to mention, we'll never be able to count how many people may not be engaging in sex work because they know they can come here and get help. And this is really important because while we have talked about flexible funding and its role in increasing access to safe, accessible, affordable permanent housing, it also is a way to increase access to safety, which is what is being demonstrated here, where we have recipients no longer having a need to engage in survival sex work because they have access to emergency funding resources. Next slide, please. And so we also did not want to disrupt the flow of the ways in which the center was working with survivors. And so we didn't talk to survivors directly. However, we asked if the center could reach out to the participant who received funding and see if they would be interested in sharing any quotes with us about how the funding has been beneficial for them. So I pulled out 2 of those quotes to share with you all today. One participant said, "Funding has been tremendously helpful from Blow. I've been able to make ends meet in my rough patch with groceries and my rent. I am very appreciative to have this program in my corner." Another participant said, "Glow has been my backbone with keeping me afloat. In a scary time, Glow has helped me with rent and utilities, as well as transportation to get to a job once was acquired. I don't know where I would be without Glow." And so this really speaks to the concrete needs that survivors have and the instrumental ways in which this funding was able to support those needs, taking away the barriers that they would typically encounter when seeking funds in other spaces or through other programs. Next slide, please. And so as I conclude today, it's really important to take a moment to pause and think through all of the information that we have been able to collect through this, the conversations with the advocates, the data that we gathered from the flexible funding tracker on who we served, what their needs are, as well as the ways in which the really important ways in which flexible funds was able to support their needs. And taking all of this together, it tells a story. It tells the story that strengthening economic support and security for survivors is a necessary approach if we are looking to prevent domestic violence. It tells the story that survivors are knowledgeable about their needs and that we, as the systems and structures that are responding to them, have to listen, pause, and take the lead from survivors. It also tells the story that flexible funding assistance is a very useful strategy in increasing safety, in increasing housing stability, and also increasing the well-being of survivors. And finally, it highlights for us that we need to continue to support research that uses diverse research methods with larger and more representative groups of survivors who are most impacted by these issues so that we can continue to build the evidence. Next slide, please. And so as I leave you all today, I want to highlight that it's important that we get to a point where all funding should be flexible funding. A lot of the struggles to support survivors in these ways that we have mentioned through the principles of financial assistance is because of the restrictions that a lot of funding sources come with. And so advocates, community-based organizations, especially culturally specific organizations, are left to navigate the murky waters of trying to determine how much money can be spent through what source without potentially getting dinged for that or getting in trouble for that. And so it's really important that we move towards a time and space in our work and our movement that all funding is flexible and can be used flexibly to respond to the identified needs of survivors. And it's also important that we continue to increase flexible funding support for survivors. It took less than 4 months to spend $36,000, and that did not meet the needs of all of the participants and the people that the center serves. And so there's a real need. The need has been articulated time and time again. And so it's time for us to step in and step up to fulfill those needs. And finally, it's really important that when agencies are implementing flexible funding program, that they are well resourced. You know, we talk a lot about making sure that there's money for the flex funding programs, but there's also an administrative part of the program. And so making sure that when we're thinking through providing flexible funding support for survivors, we also think about what the agency that is going to implement the program and the advocates who are going to manage the program, what do they need to be able to do this effectively? And making sure that those resources, whether they're monetary, whether they're related to time, or whether they're related to training and technical assistance, are provided. And so as I conclude today, I will pass it on to Lavon Morris Grant, our Director of Community Engagement, who will lead a panel discussion with our wonderful, wonderful community partners from the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania, where this pilot project was done. Thank you all.
Thank you, Funmi. Wow. The more I hear this study, and I was part of the study or working with the study, it just becomes that much more fuller and necessary. And hello, everyone. Again, I'm back. I'm Lavon Morris Grant, the Director of Community Engagement at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. And once again, I still have the big hair. It's curly and a little kinky and show the length. I have the big earrings, brown skinned, and deep red lipstick with the multicolor blouse. So it's me again, and glad to be back with you all to facilitate our next panel, which will be just as informative and awesome as the last, because our community partners are awesome and very informative in the work that they do. So I've enjoyed my role as the Director of Community Engagement and working with these group of people and all the community partners that I have the opportunity and honor to work with. And so because they are all from one particular agency, I'm going to give each of them a chance to give you a description of who they are, their role, and what they do, right? I'm just going to briefly give you information about the LGBTQ Center of Central Pennsylvania. They foster inclusive communities and holistic well-being for LGBTQ plus people through social, education, and cultural engagement. And so I'm going to leave that part there and bring Amanda in first. Amanda, who's the ED of the LGBT Center, to introduce herself and give a description of who she is. And then we could pass it to our other Amanda, who we honorably known as Carter, and then down to Tony. So you all have the floor. And thank you all so much for being a part of this.
Well, thank you so much, Lavon. And we're incredibly grateful to have been part of this flexible funding pilot project. And it's wonderful to hear again the results that Funmi shared in terms of the impact that we saw. So we're glad to be here. My name is Amanda Arbor. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman. I have short, dark hair that's shaved on one side and black rimmed glasses and a black and white striped blazer. My role with this project was on the grant management and financial management side. So working closely to make sure we were meeting the grant goals with NRCDV and making sure, practically speaking, the payments were going out to meet the needs of our participants. I'll toss it over to Carter.
Hello, everybody. I'm super happy to be here. My name is Carter. I use she, her pronouns. I am a dark-skinned Black woman with short, like a curly top. I don't know if we can say. Yeah. I don't have anything else going on my face. I'm wearing a blue, thin sweater with a collar and some stripes that the camera can't catch the stripes. My role. I work for the LGBT Center of Central PA as the site director to Glow Harrisburg, which is the LGBT Center's newest program. We are a community resource center for LGBTQ+ people of color. Tony.
Tony, please
Unmute,
unmute.
Tony, unmute.
Sorry. Hi, everybody. My name is Tony. He, him pronouns. I'm the community engagement specialist here for Glow Harrisburg. And my role with the project is to help administer the funds to participants when they come in.
Thank you, Tony, Amanda, and Carter, once again. And again, because of sake of time, right, we can never get past that time thing. And that's particularly in holding our attention spans, right, as adults, and being virtual for so long. I'm just going to jump right in. And I believe in Amanda, I'm going to address this first question to you. And Carter, if you have anything you would like to add, please feel free, okay? So this is very informal. There's no one way for us to have to, you know, do the panel, particularly because you all are from the same agency. So whatever added information you would like to add to a particular question, excuse me, please feel free to do so. And that includes you also, Tony. So I don't want you to feel that you're left out of the conversation. Okay, so we are all here again. Relax, have fun, breathe, and it's us. Technology is going to do what technology is going to do. So we will get started with this and rock and roll and give the audience what they came to hear, whatever that is. All right. So the first question that I have for you all, and for you, Amanda, to answer first, is what were some of the challenges, sticking points that the organization encountered in the process of dispersing flexible funds?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from my vantage point, kind of on the admin side, there were two that I wanted to speak to. One was just kind of adjusting our internal fiscal processes. So we had this amazing new amount of money that we were able to disperse to folks, and a lot of needs, a lot of folks needing to access those funds. And so we had to kind of quickly adjust our processes to make sure we were able to turn around checks quicker, make payments quicker, and also be able to handle higher volume, a lot more payments processing than we had done prior to having access to these funds. So that was one of the challenges that we encountered kind of on the admin side. And then sort of at the end of the grant and moving forward once the funds were dispersed, sustainability. So, you know, we had this amazing resource. Folks knew about the resource. We were getting more and more requests because of that. But then once the funds were dispersed, we no longer had that resource to be able to offer to the same degree. And so that's kind of the challenge we continue to work through now in terms of how do we continue to provide this service through other funding streams that are not always as flexible and as plentiful as this one. And I'm going to toss it to Carter because I know Carter and Tony had some things to add to this as well.
Before we talk, Carter, I'm sorry, before we toss it to Carter, I just have a quick question for you, Amanda, just so we can stay on it and not confusing the audience or in my age, forgetting the question totally. When you talk about some of the challenges with the internal infrastructure, can you give like a quick example, if you're able to, of what one of those challenges, you know, looked like, other than just that it was a challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, we previously had cut checks only every 2 weeks. You know, that was our accounting cycle when we would cut checks. But now, you know, we were getting all these requests, particularly around rental assistance, where people needed a check to get to a landlord in order to secure their housing. And so one of the ways that we had to shift was working with our accounting firm to cut checks every week instead of every 2 weeks.
Thank you for that, Amanda. I think that is just so important, right, for organizations to understand within with working with flex funding, right? That was something we all discovered together, right? That, oh, wait a minute, the infrastructure, the financial infrastructure had to change. And so thank you for adding that one example that we know that came up that we did not foresee, coming. So that was a great adjustment that you all did. And I know the clients were very appreciative, of that. So thank you. So Carter, I turn it over to you to add what pieces you want to add to any of the challenges or sticking points.
Okay, thank you, Lavon. Yeah, one of the challenges that I noticed was shifting staff perspective, because not everyone was immediately gung-ho about this concept of flex funding. I might have been excited about it, but there were people on staff that we had to, I don't want to say convince, but we had ongoing conversations about this during our staff meetings, because some people were uncomfortable with the idea that we're just giving people money because they say they need it. And I think at one point the language was used that we're spoiling participants. And I think that all stems from a lot of us being programmed that we have to struggle first in order to receive something. So we had a lot of conversation around that, and eventually we all landed close enough on the same page that we could implement the program as intended. I know, Tony, you had something too.
Yeah. Before you go, Tony, I just want to say to you, Amanda, Carter, I so appreciate your transparency in that piece, right? Because that's a hard piece to unload, right? Of the mindsets of us as advocates, right? And so I just wanted you to know, I so appreciate your bravery and courage to put that out there, because though it happened at y'all's program, it's good for the other audience members to see how this can go within their programs, that it just doesn't impact you all that are dispersing the funds, but it impacts the totality of the organization, right? Of getting that mindset. And I believe Funmi talked a lot about that in the findings, and so did Lil when they talked about us changing perspectives on the African immigrant populations, right? So, and how we've all been socialized and programmed into trusting survivors with monies and not getting receipts, so to speak, right? Getting proof that that they are even worthy of receiving these funds. So thank you for that. And Tony, it's all yours.
Just to piggyback off of Carter's last statement about shifting perspectives, one of the reasons why we kind of had to shift perspective is because with some of our funding, we weren't sure if folks requesting the flex funding would be using the money for what it's supposed to be for. For example, if they're known to be struggling with like substance abuse disorder, it was kind of challenging to figure out, well, we know you need the funds, but it's also, are you going to be utilizing the funds for what we're giving them to you for? We didn't really, I'll say that was a major sticking point for us. We had to have ongoing conversations, like Carter said, for a few of our participants. And then another sticking point that we had was one of our participants in particular coming to rely on the funding, seeing it as like a forever source for them to be able to use, and trying to get them to understand that it's not a forever thing, you know what I mean? So those were two of the major sticking points for us.
Wow. Thank you. I know we had many meetings, Carter, around some of these issues, and trying to of us all just trying to get on the same page and get everyone as comfortable with the understanding and principles of flex funding, right? I know when I came into this project, I came into like, yes, let's get it, just give it away, never thinking the upside of it, of how people's perspectives were going to be taken into account, right? Never thought about it from that process. And the money's going from me, the organization, directly to the person, and knowing some of the history of the people's lives, right? As Tony so elaborately said about the substance abuse piece. And we worked through it, right? We worked through that piece. We had quite a few conversations on that piece, and it got worked through, and learned a lot of other things that we were not looking for in the findings, right? Other things showed up, and that was one of the other, for me, that was one of the other exciting pieces of the research, of finding things that were not part of the findings. So hopefully we'll be able to capture that. And as we roll this out to the field, right, we'll be able to give some nuances of the things that took place that we were not expecting. So thank you all for such candid answers on that. And so as I move us into the next set of questions, the next question, Carter, I'm gonna start with you, if that's okay. I'm gonna start this question off with you, and then you all can decide how you want to, add to it. Excuse me. And that would be, what were the major takeaways and lessons the organization learned from the flexible funding pilot project?
Sure. I have a few, but firstly, flex funding works, hands down. So as a pilot, we saw what money like this can do for a participant, our small Harrisburg community, or queer and trans, Black and brown Harrisburg community. It was able to take people from a really rough place to a place of relative stability that they might not have ever had or had in a very long time. So especially when it comes to rental assistance, because that was the thing that seemed to have made the biggest impact. And I know Funmi mentioned this in the report, but like the participant that comes to mind that I wanted to share their story with you all, they were incarcerated, and when they came home, they came to GLOW. They were already a GLOW participant. They came to GLOW, and they made it very clear that they were ready to do some things differently. They just needed support getting into this apartment. They needed the first month's rent. They needed the deposit. They needed that push, that booster. They had a job lined up. They needed transportation to get to the job until they got the first check, and they would take it from there. They needed groceries until the food stamp card arrived in the mail. And we were able to make those 3 different disbursements, and they're good. To this day, they're doing well in their new apartment at their new job. So it's awesome, it works. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that all the hoops, paperwork, application, it's not necessary. I know those of y'all that are already doing the work know this, but it's something that we needed to learn on our side. We were able to provide support to people that were struggling without making them feel more shame than they already were experiencing. Just being able to provide quote unquote charity without making the person feel low. Yeah, I thought that was one of our takeaways. And it distinguished us from other resource providers in our area because we knew, and the participant knew, if you go anywhere else, you might hear back from someone next month. Whereas if you come here, we can walk into the room, pull out a gift card and put it in your hand and say, let us know how it goes. I think the last thing that I took away from this is that money is not everything. So there were a couple of instances where we were putting money in a participant's hand so that they could tackle this issue. And then we see down the line, like, this issue has not been resolved. So that brought to our attention that, okay, this participant needs more than money. Like, this participant needs more intensive case management than we've been offering, or that we're equipped to provide. So that was a really eye-opening experience that had us reaching out to other agencies and organizations that were doing work that we don't do. But it really helped us get much needed support to participants that we weren't providing close to what they needed before the flex funding was introduced. Tony, I know you wanted to say something.
We'll go with Tony, and then we'll get to the last question, and I'll start that off with you, Amanda, on the last question.
I think one of the major takeaways for me for the project is that it helped to strengthen the relationships that we've had with our participants. Like Carter said, before we got the flex funding, it was like we had a rapport with our participants, but I think once we did get the funding, the relationships got a lot deeper, only because we were able to assist with so much more. And with that, participants felt way more comfortable with us, being able to, say what they needed to say, but with the understanding that, you're not going to have to jump through hoops. If you tell me this traumatic thing, we're only going to go over this once. You know what I mean? We don't need to hash out so much more than that. But like Carter said, I think it just helped to strengthen our relationships, and not just for that period of time when we had the funding, but we're seeing that this is like an ongoing thing. Programs that we implemented while we had that funding are still going on, and those folks are still coming into the center. So that's been a really good takeaway for me.
That is so awesome to hear, Tony, and Amanda and Carter for the organization, right? Wow, wow. I want to say so much more, but we are so limited in time. And so I want to leave space, but I am like bursting hearing this information. So thank you. And Amanda and Carter know how I burst, but I'm going to keep it on the kill so we can get to this last question. And if there are any questions from the audience, maybe we can answer one or two as we move into our next segment of the agenda. So Amanda, and then whoever else, how did the Flex Funding Grant enhance the capacity of the organization to GLOW participants?
Yeah, so the biggest area was it allowed us to hire a full-time housing case manager at GLOW, which was really a game changer for us. So prior to that, Carter and Tony were handling all of our housing and emergency requests on top of what was already more than full-time jobs that each of them were doing. And so our housing case manager came in kind of at the tail end of this pilot project, but has really done incredible work being the kind of single point of contact on staff for all of our housing and emergency requests, setting up a lot of great structures and processes, and really taking the burden off of the rest of the staff so they can kind of focus on their unique roles, and also developing relationships. The case managers developed relationships with landlords as well as with participants and other agencies. And so that's something that has really helped this to become more sustainable for us as an organization.
That is awesome, Amanda. And like I said, I would love to deep dive into so much more, but time is what it is. And I know we probably got questions, but what we're going to do, we're going to come back to them maybe if we have some time at the end. And if not, I know one of the things I was thinking about was bringing you all back to do a webinar on what we've discovered, what worked, what didn't, and go into more detail. So that's something that's already swirling in my mind. So Amanda, Carter, and Tony, be ready for my email when I'll be like, hey, we put together this webinar. And hopefully our audience will come back to be able to hear more of how this worked for you all, even though we have to study, but how it worked for you all. So I want to take the time once again to thank each of you for being a part of this panel and for just being a part of NRCDV and the work we do and informing us of how we can work with you and inform the field of making, hopefully one day get into where all funding will be flexible. So thank you for being a part of the study, and I appreciate each and every one of you. So, and now at this point, I will pass it on to my colleague, Shenna Morris, and thank you again for being a part of us.
Thank you so much for that great panel discussion, Lavon, and all of our panelists. Good afternoon. My name is Shenna Morris, and I am the Vice President of Policy and Systems Change at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I identify as Black. I have my hair in a braided bun, and I am wearing glasses on my face. I'm dressed in a floral shirt and a Black blazer. So I'd like to weave together our conversation from today with policy recommendations that surfaced from some of what our panelists shared today, as well as from other conversations that we've had and other work that we've done with them. It's important to note that centered in every new learning or new idea and policy recommendation that we take away today are the stories and experiences of survivors and advocates. The policy recommendations that I will touch on are no different. And I want to lift up that Black, Brown, Indigenous survivors, survivors living on the margins and who have been historically oppressed in their communities are the creators of these recommendations by way of the stories that they've shared. The full policy brief highlighting these recommendations will be released after today's briefing event. Before going directly into the recommendations that surfaced, though, I feel it's important to always ground our audience in the policy priorities of NRCDV. My hope is that in doing so, you will see how we strive to create solutions that are survivor-generated, cohesive, and grounded in racial equity and disrupting cycles of oppression. Could we go to the next slide, please? So quickly, because I know that we are limited on time, NRCDV prioritizes the following in our policy and systems advocacy efforts: building and supporting survivors' advocacy capacity, meaning their ability to actively engage and inform legislative, administrative, and community policymaking efforts. Priorities around promoting survivor-centered, equitable, and just policies, promoting family and community-centered policies. Next slide, please. Increasing economic security for survivors, their families, and their communities. Increasing survivor access to affordable housing options. And building advocates' state and local advocacy capacity. So each of these priorities acts as a compass in guiding where our organizational attention and focus is in policy advocacy. It also helps us to communicate our areas of focus externally to allied partners, such as all of you joining us on today's call. I want to acknowledge that we know there are many issue layers to look at and engage in within each of these priorities and in addressing gender-based violence. So as we now move into looking at some of the specific recommendations, I hope that you will see how our priority areas and the solutions shared are connected to the wisdom of the advocates and survivors you've heard from today. Next slide. And you can move past this one as well. Thank you. So again, I've taken the approach to restate some of the earlier mentioned priorities that you just heard so that you can see the connections between them and the recommendations. So when we talk about the priority of promoting survivor-centered, equitable, and just policies, as well as increased survivor access to affordable housing options. Next slide, please. The recommendation that arose from the listening sessions with Black immigrant communities, as well as the Flex funding study, was to develop policy tools such as housing eligibility waivers that can relax permanent housing eligibility requirements for trauma survivors, such as victims of domestic and sexual violence. We know that securing accessible and affordable housing can be challenging for survivors as they are navigating the range of emotions and the depths of trauma that they have experienced. We've heard today that often the added layer of producing documentation and other forms of evidence to meet eligibility requirements for services can further intensify the anxiety and trauma that survivors are experiencing. Eligibility requirements around criminal records or frequency of engagement with criminal justice systems is also very often barrier producing on survivors' access to housing, as we heard in our opening statements from the interim director of OVW, particularly as they relate to some of her sharing around the nuisance ordinances. We also heard how survivors' experiences with housing eligibility requirements can look different across the country and across the many identities that survivors bring. For example, eligibility requirements connected to documentation status, credit history, and family size can present barriers that have greater levels of complexity for immigrant and LGBTQ+ survivors. Policy tools such as a housing eligibility waiver would prevent survivors' housing eligibility status and access from being measured in the same ways as individuals who are not experiencing trauma. Additionally, this type of policy solution provides a more trauma-informed approach to honoring survivors' needs and their realities. Next slide, please. Connected to the priorities of promoting survivor-centered, equitable, and just policies, again, the ones that we just mentioned, and promoting family and community-centered policies. Next slide, please. Is the recommendation to broaden definitions of family used to determine eligibility for services and access to housing and social programs. I've heard similar sentiments from many communities of color and culturally specific communities over the years. Survivors of domestic and sexual violence may often have family networks that are beyond their immediate biological families, as we heard from our panelists today. This might include nieces, nephews, cousins, or what I like to term a family, such as elders in the community that survivors may house with them. A survivor's ability to remain housed with these members can significantly impact their decision to seek out safe housing and other supports. This is especially true, as we heard today, for survivors from small cultural or close-knit communities. So the recommendation of broadening definitions of eligible family members acknowledges the diversity of family configurations that survivors of violence may have and recognizes the support networks that may be instrumental in maintaining or supporting their outreach for assistance. Next slide, please. Now let's look at what emerged that is connected to the policy priority of building advocates' state and local advocacy capacity. Next slide, please. As it relates to this priority area, the recommendation is to increase designated funding supports for culturally specific programs that have deep expertise in responding to the needs of marginalized and underserved survivors. As we've seen through today's panel discussion, culturally specific programs have a deep knowledge and understanding of the methods of outreach, the service needs, and the barriers survivors from specific cultural communities face. They are best positioned to respond to these survivors' needs. Now, this does not dismiss the collective responsibility of all of us to center our work, program designs, and efforts in racial equity-based practices. Nor does it excuse us from being the utmost prepared in having culturally responsive services and community reach. However, by increasing supports for culturally specific programs, we enhance the availability of housing and support service solutions that are culturally responsive, diverse, and innovative. Next slide, please. Again, looking at this priority to build advocates' state and local advocacy capacity. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide. There we go. Additional recommendations surface as an administrative policy opportunity to require applicant and grantee submissions of accessibility and equity plans that demonstrate population inclusivity across program and service designs. This recommendation would include opportunities for programs to capture qualitative data on progress on plan implementation during reporting periods. Now, I acknowledge that there are efforts currently in place to do this in some of our funding administrative systems and universes, and there still remains opportunity to dive deeper. After all, we know that the path to racial equity is indeed a journey of continuous change and progression. We often hear from survivors of color, immigrant survivors, survivors with disabilities, LGBTQ+ survivors, that despite the programmatic, culturally responsive mechanisms and resources that exist, the base is still at the surface of meeting people's needs in the ways that they need. For example, thinking about the linguistic needs of Black immigrant survivors, limitations continue to exist in having resources that meet the specific dialect needs of survivors. The approach often remains to lump identities and offer perhaps the most common language resources. And I think we heard this today. Development of accessibility and equity plans really gives communities an opportunity to lay out a roadmap of what is available and what gaps exist. Now, again, the full review of these policy recommendations will be released post-call. And I want to conclude this portion, given our time, of the recommendations highlighted in the briefing. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Caroline LaPorte with STARS Indigenous Safe Housing Center. And I thank you for your time.
Hi, everybody. Since we are short on time, I'll quickly introduce myself. I am not going to go through my slides. I see that we have 3 minutes. So my name is Caroline LaPorte. I am the director of the STARS Indigenous Safe Housing Center. I am also an immediate descendant of the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, where I also serve as an elected associate judge. I think I'm going to do a few things just in light of time, Kim. So I see your message in regards to controlling the slides. So first I'm going to describe myself. So I am a Native woman. I have brown skin. I have dark brown long hair. I am wearing a black cardigan, and I do have on some strawberry earrings that I purchased at the Seminole Tribe of Florida's Tribal Fair. So what I'm going to do very quickly, if it's all right with everyone, is I'm just going to do a quick reminder that this week is the National Week of Action for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Most of you have had some exposure to this persistent issue. Again, I'm not going to go through my slides, Kim. But what I will say is that STARS as the Indigenous Safe Housing Center and as a project of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center is taking a different approach and is focusing more very clearly on a prevention lens to MMIW and definitely considers housing to be one of the key protective factors in regards to reducing risk towards victimization within that space. So two things that I wanted to make everyone aware of. One is that the National Week of Action right now is going on. Brittany posted the link in the chat there. You can register for any of those events that are ongoing right now, and you can also watch them next week if you choose to do so. We do have a webinar specific to STARS, specific to housing, very specific to what we're going to talk about today. So that's kind of convenient. So the registration link is there for you if you'd like to register for that. And then the other thing that I am going to do really quickly is I'm going to drop into the chat we've got a practical responses brief that we created for tribal housing entities, tribally designated housing entities, tribal policymakers, community members, residents, advocates, et cetera, in regards to MMIW specifically and the housing framework. So I will share that. Certainly, if anyone has any questions, my email is right there. And I am more than happy to sit down and have any sort of conversations with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for dropping that information into the chat box. I would like to apologize to you for our inability to allow you enough time to get through your presentation. I would like to thank you all for attending today's policy and research briefing. My understanding is that materials will be forthcoming in the recording shared from this briefing. I wish you all a great and wonderful day. And again, thank you all for being with us this afternoon.